Imagine that 30 years ago, somebody had said that they had discovered some magic words. And the magic words were abracadabra 1, 2, 3. And you simply said abracadabra 1, 2, 3, John, and you were able to talk with your friend John wherever they were in the world, and he could talk to you. What would be the economic consequences? Well, provided the discoverer of these words very effectively filed an intellectual property right, she would undoubtedly be the richest person on earth. Her intellectual property lawyers would probably be pretty rich as well. She'd probably pay quite a lot of money to the estate agents, which allowed her to buy extremely nice properties. She might spend a large amount of money on, high fashion design, and the fashion designers would be very rich. Her party organizers would be very rich, and there would be a lot of people to serve at those parties. But as I've described it, nobody would be employed in what we now call mobile phone business, which she has discovered. Now, information and communications technology is not magic. But I want to argue that there are some features about information and communications technology which are closer to that magic that I've just described in their economic consequences than previous technologies, such as the technologies of the electromechanical age. And I'm going to argue that this has quite profound consequences for the nature of economics and society, for inequality, of where wealth resides, and for public policy. And there are implications which I have partly, if I could just go into a quick advertisement, discussed in the book which is available for sale outside, which I have just produced, called Between Debt and the Devil. But actually, what I'm going to talk about today was even more discussed in a book I produced 3 years ago called Economics After the Crisis, which were, in fact, the product of my Lionel Robbins Memorial Lectures at the LSE. And I want to argue, and this is where the title comes from, that when you think about the way that the economy is changing and technology is changing, there are some really quite profound issues to do with the relationship between capitalism and human welfare in what I describe paradoxically as the high-tech, high-touch world, and I'll try and explain what I mean by that. Let me start by describing what I think is an orthodox neoclassical economics case for capitalism. We believe that there's a process called technical progress which drives productivity, which drives economic growth as measured by GDP per capita, which drives an increase in human welfare. We believe that market competition will tend to maximize the efficient allocation of the factors of production and achieve growth. That entrepreneurship is the process which discovers opportunities for productivity growth. And if you are a true believer in neoclassical economics, that the rewards in the market that people get paid reflect marginal social product. That people who get paid more do get more because they're increasing the size of the economic cake to a greater extent than people who get paid less, and that that's good for human welfare. We believe that wealth reflects efficient capital accumulation, that wealth equals capital, and that capital is the previous year's capital plus the investment during that year, that savings equals investment, and that wealth is accumulated out of investment, and that sophisticated financial systems ensure an efficient allocation of that investment which drives the accumulation of capital, which is wealth. The argument is that there is significant inequality for sure, but over time, a rising tide will raise all boats, that all will benefit from these processes, provided in particular that we have adequate investment in skills which are key to the process of raising productivity and raising the growth rate. And what I'm going to suggest is that there are some changes going on in the nature of our economy which challenge pretty much every one of those assumptions on this page. Now, in part, the confidence in the ability of capitalism to deliver growth and then deliver welfare That has been challenged by the experience of the last 8 years, where after the global financial crisis of 2008, the recovery from that crisis has been extraordinarily slow and difficult. So that, for instance, in the Eurozone, GDP per capita is still actually below where it was in 2007. In the UK, it is barely above, and even in America, it's 10 or 15% below where it was on pre-crisis trends. And there's a set of issues about why recovery from the global financial crisis has been so slow and difficult, and they are the issues which I discuss in my book, Between Debt and the Devil. But actually, that's not what I'm going to focus on today. I'm going to focus on, quite separate from that sort of cyclical problem post the financial crisis of 2008, is there something more fundamental? And in particular, does that challenge the idea of, number one, that technical progress produces productivity, produces growth, produces an increase in human welfare? Are we, in some sense, in capitalism, facing not just a debt overhang problem, a problem of growth in the economy today, but something more fundamental, what some people call a secular stagnation? Are we running out of the opportunities to improve GDP per capita and achieve human welfare? And in a sense, that argument has been best put recently very clearly by Robert Gordon in his interesting new book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth. Now, Gordon, in that book, argues that in a sense we're running out of opportunities to improve productivity. I'm not convinced by that. I think that, actually, and I'm going to come back to this, that the progress of information and communications technology may be putting us on the verge of an acceleration of measured productivity growth. But I think Gordon's second argument is a really important one, which is, even if we are achieving productivity improvements, they're simply less important to human welfare than the productivity and income improvements of an earlier era. Gordon, in his book, asks you to compare what happened to standards of living as a result of new products and services which were introduced, let us say, in the developed economies between, say, 1870 and 1970. And they included things like almost everybody having running water and piped sewage, vacuum cleaners and washing machines, railways, autos, aeroplanes, safe, unadulterated food delivered by a branded consumer goods system and an efficient retail and including chilled and frozen distribution systems, film, radio, television, telephones, and vaccination against childhood and other diseases that meant that it wasn't the case that a significant proportion of the children you had died in infancy. And then he says, compare it what the last 45 years have delivered. They've given us computers, they've given us mobile phones with extraordinary computing capacity, they've given us the internet, they've given us social media and search engine, they've given us apps and bots, but I don't really understand what bots are, but I'm trying to catch up because I've worked out what apps are. And in the healthcare area, they've given us some major breakthroughs like statins, but he basically says that list on the left is more fundamental than that list on the right. And just try this choice. Suppose I give you a choice that you have to give up everything on the left, but you get to keep the things on the right, versus you get to keep everything on the right, but you have to give up everything on the left. Most people will accept that the ones on the left are far more transformational of human welfare. And that may suggest that actually we face a function something like this, that even if we will relentlessly, through productivity growth, go on improving measured GDP per capita, its impact, in some sense, on human welfare, on happiness, on utility, will be subject to a diminishing marginal return. That the process of moving Africa from its present level of GDP per capita to our level of GDP per capita will make a lot of difference to human welfare, because there will be a whole load of women who don't spend hours of the day in hard manual labor picking up water or tilling in the fields, but that frankly, when you get to the developed world level, increases in GDP per capita are just not that important. Now, I believe that that is the case. I'm going to come back to the fact that later I'm not a no-growther. I don't believe that we should say there should be no growth, but I simply think it's less important than it used to be. Now, if that is the case, if it is the case that the ability to improve human welfare and people's self-declared happiness, utility, as a result of simply growing productivity and prosperity as measured by GDP per capita, if that is hitting declining marginal returns, it may be that the happiness of individuals is much more determined by a set of things which are nothing to do with the economy. They are to do with their personal circumstances, whether they meet partners in life whom they feel happy with, whether their children do well, or it may get heavily driven by relative status relative to others, by the degree of inequality within society and how they feel they are doing. And in that respect, it then becomes important to note that alongside this era, which, if Robert Gordon is right, is not delivering fundamental changes in welfare in the way that it did in the past, what we are also seeing is dramatic increases in inequality. Now, this varies across the developed world, and in a sense, America is the most extreme, but the tendency is there in all major developed economies. What this chart shows is that over the last 35 years, the bottom 20% of American workers have received no real wage increase whatsoever, while the income of the top 1% has gone up 3 times, and the income of the top 0.1% has gone up even more than that, and the top 0.01% even more than that, in what some people call a sort of fractal mathematical pattern. Now, the argument of neoclassical economics and the defense of the free market is, look, of course inequality goes up and down through time, of course there's significant inequality, but in the long term, the process of growth raises all boats. Everybody participates in the increase in GDP per capita. And actually, that is probably true. But the long term is quite a long term. Because what happens as you have technological growth to the relative dispersion of GDP per capita, who gets the shares of it between skilled workers or unskilled workers, between capital or labor, depends very specifically on a particular nature of the technology, what that technology does to the opportunities to substitute capital or labor or to substitute skilled labor for unskilled labor. And it turns out that in the past, we have seen very major variations in the relationship between what is happening to output per capita and what is happening, for instance, to the real wages of workers. This chart is taken from an article which is called Engels' Pause. And the reason why it's called Engels' Pause is that Friedrich Engels in 1842 writes Condition of the Working Class in England, and he argues that the working class is being impoverished by the Industrial Revolution. By the end of the 19th century, people think that that's nonsense. No, the industrialization is delivering prosperity to everybody. But the reason why it's called Engels' Pause is that it actually does appear that for the first half of the 19th century, the working class got very, very little benefit out of industrialization whatsoever because, and you can't understand this chart because the legend has not been put on it, 0.6 is the rate of growth of productivity, and 0.0, the red bit, is the rate of growth of real wages. And what happens is there is a particular constellation of what his technologies are doing in the early 18th century, where pretty much all of the benefit of that technological revolution, of, for instance, the early bits of cotton spinning and weaving, accrue to either a small number of skilled workers or capitalists, and almost none to the mass of workers. And then in the late 19th century, it changes round the other way. And 1860 to 1900 really is a period of extraordinary transformations in the living standards of millions of people. The impact depends on the particular nature of the technology. And information and communications technology has 3 quite remarkable and distinctive characteristics, which make it it different from previous waves of technological improvements such as that of the steam engine, electrification, the electromechanical factory, etc.? First, we have this extraordinary phenomenon of the endlessly collapsing cost of hardware relative to performance, driven by Moore's law, that basically every 18 months or every 2 years, you get to buy twice as much computing power for the same price. Moore's law is actually a very specific law about the amount of processing power that you can put in a chip, etc., but it applies more generally in terms of computing, communications bandwidth or memory or processing power. There is an order of magnitude speed of technological improvement which we did not see in the electromechanical era. Secondly, we have this extraordinary phenomenon of zero marginal cost of replication. Fancy way of saying that once you've made one copy of a bit of software, the next billion copies of that software cost you pretty much close to zero. And there's nothing like that in the arena of agricultural mechanization or car factories, etc. And third, what's called network externality effects, which means that everybody uses Facebook because everybody uses Facebook. Everybody uses Microsoft, not because Microsoft is the best software in the world, because it isn't, but because everybody else uses software, and therefore it makes it easy to interconnect with them. And when you put those three features together, it turns out that information and communications technology has enormous capacity to create enormous returns to capital or skilled labor with very little investment and with very little employment. So that if I was to compare, back this way, if I was to compare, the figures are here from 2014, but the magnitudes are still the same. If I was to compare the market value of Microsoft or Google or Facebook versus the number of employees, you find that these are enormous companies with actually, in global labor market terms, very few employees at all. So Microsoft, Google at that time, when I measured this, the biggest company in the world, 404 billion market value, about 50,000 employees. As a relationship between equity market value and the number of employees, this is completely different than was the case when General Motors was the biggest company in the world in equity market value and employed about 1 million people. So we have the ability to create enormous equity market value with very few employees and with very little investment. Now, an economist would define investment as being the economic activity in a year which is not devoted to producing current goods and services, but which is devoting to building capital assets which will help produce current goods and services in future years. Try and work out how much investment went into Facebook before it floated for $170 billion of market value. As best I can work out, it required about 5,000 software engineer person years. Let's say 1,000 software engineers working for 5 years. That's 34 million of equity value per software engineer year putting into building the machine, which is Facebook. As a ratio between investment and wealth created, that is completely different from the amount of investment that had to go into Henry Ford's factories and to the steel mills that had to produce the machinery in Henry Ford's factories before Henry Ford could start producing his cars and making his money. We have here an extraordinary ability at the top end of the income distribution, the wealth income distribution, to create enormous wealth with very few employees and with very little investment. Not quite my imaginary discoverer of abracadabra 1, 2, 3, but a good deal closer to it than we used to think was the case with economics. Now, what is happening, however, at the other end of the income distribution? What is going to happen, what is happening, and what is going to happen to jobs? I believe that we are probably on the verge of an acceleration of the process of the application of information and communications technology to enable us to robotize and automate economic functions. Now, I can't go through why I believe that, but I would refer you to books like Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee's very fine book, The Second Machine Age, which I think argues very effectively that as we apply a computing power which is relentlessly increasing, we will create robots which increasingly can do more and more functions. They are capable of more and more sophisticated man-machine interfaces, and they are capable of relentlessly better understanding, as it were, of the context of which they are operating, and therefore they're able to operate in a more effective fashion. And Brynjolfsson and McAfee and other people argue, and I think effectively, that we are going to see a whole series of functions which are effectively going to be doable by robots, if not in 5 years or in 10 years, then in 15 or 20. That the issue is simply how long does this take? The fact that it is going to happen is relentless. I think we are probably on the verge of driverless cars, but driverless cars actually are not all that important economically because we drive our own cars. But think about the impact on the supply of jobs for young men who are not very academic if the whole of truck driving disappears, which I think it will. If the whole of construction, bricklaying, is done by robots. I think we are probably on the verge of dramatic changes in retail. The British Retail Consortium recently put out a report, and I think it was quite a compelling and a well-argued report, that over the next 10 years, probably a third of jobs in retailing could go as a result of the shift to online, the use of self-checkout, robotization in distribution and in-store logistics, etc. Now, what is the consequence of that oh yes, and I just wanted to say, and I think therefore there are perfectly reasonable forecasts which suggest really quite dramatic paces of the computerization or the automation of particular functions. That telemarketeers, people sitting in call centers, is something which is just 99% sure to disappear in the next 15 years or so. Now, you can see that there is something wrong with this list, because it suggests that there's a 43% chance that economists will be automated away. And it's quite clear to anybody that economists do something so completely unique and expertise that it will never be replaced by a computer. But there is basically, an argument here, and I think it is a compelling argument, that we are going to see waves of automation. And that the sort of things that we're going to be left with, because they are quite difficult to automate, is personal trainers or recreational therapists. Now, I do not believe that this is going to result in huge levels of unemployment, because I believe that what we will continually see is that we will automate away some jobs and we will create other jobs. But I think it is at least possible, indeed I think it's a pretty strong hypothesis, that those new jobs may be quite lowly paid. That we may be going through a next 50 years, which is rather like the early 19th century in terms of how the balance of technology plays through to the labor market. Now, it's difficult to be certain of that, but one of the best sources of data on labor markets is from the US. It's from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. And every 4 years or so, they update their forecasts of where jobs are going to come from over the next 10 years. And this shows you their forecast from 2012 through to 2022. And they set out in particular each time a list of the top 10 and then the next 10 categories of where jobs will come from. And this was the list they produced in 2012, and so far the trends 4 years into this are pretty much in line with what they're saying. And what they were saying, and what appears to be occurring, is that the jobs where we're getting lots of more of them is jobs which at the moment are what I call face-to-face service jobs that we haven't yet managed to automate, like personal care aides, home health aides, food preparation and servicing aides, nursing aides, janitors and cleaners. And the jobs are being created in large numbers. The US is creating a large number of jobs. But have a look at what the wage is there for that sector and what it is for all sectors. In 9 out of the top 10 job creation sectors in the US at the moment, the median wage in that sector is well below the all-sector average. Indeed, it is true with only one exception, which is registered nurses, number 2. And note that it is not till number 26 in this list that you get to software developers and applications, for the simple reason that to create all the software applications that the world could possibly need, you don't need all that many software workers. So yes, people say, oh, well, in this world, we'll all become software application developers. We'll all become games developers, etc. Well, you can skill up as many people as you want to do that, but there's only a relatively small number of the best of those are going to earn high income from that activity. And all of this may help explain why we are seeing this extraordinary phenomenon over the last 14 years. These are figures from the ILO, but the OECD have produced similar things, which show a really quite dramatic divergence between what is happening to average labour productivity and average real wages. Again, a repeat of that pattern which we saw back in the early 19th century. So I think it is the case that information and communications technology may have an extraordinary ability to deliver huge wealth to Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, Sergey Brin, Jeff Bezos, while at the same time automating away jobs. New jobs are created, but those jobs are, as economists would put it, at quite a low equilibrium real wage rate. We could see a very rapid pace of productivity improvement, but also a widening level of inequality. A widening level which might be okay if we were confident that this explosion of productivity was delivering huge increases in average human welfare, but if at the end of the day getting an ever cheaper iPhone is just much less important than getting piped water, then that increase in the average, as it were, prosperity is not going to offset for people the harmful impact of this increase in inequality. ICT, information and communications technology, is driving, I think, an increase in inequality. But what's interesting is we're also getting a very strong increase in inequality, which you might think has nothing to do with ICT, because it's a return to some very tactile capabilities, some very non-information and communications capabilities, what I call the high-touch environment of physical prowess or beauty or artistic prowess or luxury brand design. Because again, look at where wealth resides in the modern economy. Think about Hermes, luxury goods. Again, what you get is extraordinary market capitalizations and very few employees in it. Because the value resides in this incredible intangible thing called brand value, where people pay an enormous amount of money for the good design of a Hermes scarf, even though in terms of the labor that goes into it, it's a minute fraction of that. But we also get extraordinary phenomena like David and Victoria Beckham. Now, there's a very interesting phenomenon that the returns to sporting or artistic stardom have soared. Think about Stanley Matthews. Stanley Matthews, one of the great football players of the 1950s, probably ended his life with a standard of living somewhat like that of a nice upper-middle-class doctor, right? He was never remotely in the super-rich. David Beckham is in the super-rich. How did that happen? Well, partly it is the product of an increasingly rich society where the mass of society has enough income that it can spend its income on celebrity-branded goods. David Beckham is hugely rich because his fans have enough money to buy the perfume that has his name, or the strip when he was back at Manchester United that had his number on, whereas back in the 1950s, Stanley Matthews fans could only just afford the ticket to attend the match and did not have that surplus to spend on everything else. J.K. Rowling is, of course, also rich on a massive scale. Compare J.K. Rowling's wealth with, let us say, C.S. Lewis or A.A. Milne or other people who produced very effective children's books. There is an extraordinary phenomenon going on here. The returns to artistic or celebrity stardom have absolutely soared. And it's something to do with, as we get richer, we are enabled to devote more of our money to buying intangible goods, branded goods, etc., but that delivers huge celebrity rents. And by the way, those celebrity rents are subject to extraordinarily strong winner-takes-all effects. And that actually has something to do with information and communication technology. There's a wonderful article in the economic literature by a man called Sherwin Rosen. It's from several decades ago now, called The Returns to Stardom. And it points out that when we created radio and television, the returns to being an artist became much more concentrated. Because previously, there had been lots of people who sang and performed in theatres in every single separate theatre or music hall across the country. But once you had radio and television, one person at the centre could be the dominant brand name and could get an extraordinary return. So there's something about an economy of greater prosperity and of ICT which produces extraordinary celebrity rents and extraordinary returns to intangible brands such as luxury brands. There are also, of course, huge returns to CEOs, to top management returns. The ratio between what CEOs of companies have paid and the average worker has soared over the last 20 years. Now, people often look at that and say, well, that just shows that remuneration committees are not doing their job. They're not making sure that people are only paid for performance. They're allowing people to be paid for failure. But I actually think there is a more fundamental problem going on, and it goes to the core of one of the economic theories I referred to earlier. You can believe that people will be paid their marginal social productivity, i.e., that people will get paid more if they're making a bigger contribution to society, if you believe two things. One, if you believe that rational competition in labour markets will mean that individuals are paid their marginal private product, i.e. that the CEO is only paid the extent to which he or she is making the company richer. And you have to believe that rational competition in product and capital markets will mean that marginal private product equals marginal social product. That what increases the equity value of Hermes increases the social value of society. We have an awful lot of focus in the area of overpaid COEs on the top of this, telling remuneration committees that they aren't doing their job. I think the much bigger issue is the second of these. I think we live in an economy where there is an increasing potential divergence between marginal private product and marginal social product. The economist Roger Bootle, and I take this idea from him, in a book he wrote about 6 years ago, drew a distinction in economic activity between what he called creative activities. And he didn't mean creative in an artistic sense. He meant things that increase the pot of available GDP and therefore perhaps human welfare, and activities which are distributive in the sense of you compete with one another and one of you gets more of it and the other gets less of it. And, I mean, very clear example of the latter is if Richard Murphy and I now went off and played poker together and one of us won and one of us lost, one of us would be richer and one of us would be poorer, but we wouldn't change GDP in any way. Going off into a corner and playing poker is a distributive activity. It is not a social value creating activity, except to the extent that any of you might get pleasure from watching one of us win or lose. The hypothesis I want to put forward is that there's quite a lot of functions in a modern economy which are essentially distributive, not creative, social value creating. Let's think about sports and artistic stars. I mean, it's great fun to go and watch Wimbledon tennis, but will it be any more fun? Will it be any greater for human welfare in 20 years' time, even if they've got better at playing the tennis. I imagine that the impact on human welfare will be exactly the same. And essentially what is going on there is a distributive game. One of them will win and another will lose. There's nothing about that process which is going to make human welfare higher. It's a perfectly legitimate process. It's, as it were, there as something at the moment which gives us pleasure. But crucially, and this is the crucial measure of it, it's an area where increasing skill changes, for an individual, changes their relative ranking versus others, but has no necessary consequences for generalized human welfare, right? If over the next 30 years the average speed of serve goes up from whatever it is now, I find it impossible to even understand how it could be fast, 100 miles or so to 140 miles, I don't think people will enjoy tennis anymore. I don't think in any sense human welfare will have gone up. So poker playing and most games are clearly distributive activities, but actually an awful lot of legal activity is distributive activity. I mean, suppose over the next 20 years the average intellectual capability of divorce lawyers improves. And suppose potential divorcees pay them higher and higher fees in a sort of endless arms race between one and the other to hire ever better, cleverer people. There's no increase in human welfare, it's a distributive activity. And so actually is a lot of commercial legal activity. It's one person fighting against another. So also actually is a hell of a lot of financial trading activity. I can give you a defense that a certain amount of financial trading activity is required to create a certain amount of liquidity, without which we will get an efficient mobilization of capital, etc. Yes, that's true to a point, but a lot of it is essentially a distributive activity in which some will win and some will lose. Let's think about luxury brands and fashion goods. I think it's good that we have a society where people create luxury brands and fashion goods, and each year there's a new fashion, and each year the chief executives and the designers of the different Hermes or Louis Vuitton compete with one another in order to attract the consumption of people able to afford it. And I'm perfectly happy to live in a society like that. But this isn't a process where in 20 years' time we're going to be happier or in better welfare because that competition has occurred. It's a competition which essentially goes round in circles. But, by the way, and this gets to my remuneration committee point, if you were on the remuneration committee of Hermes or Louis Vuitton, and if you had somebody who had that peculiar ability to sense what is going to work in the designs next year and capture the consumer's imagination, it might be worth your while paying them an absolute fortune. The marginal private product to that company might be very high indeed, even if the marginal social product in terms of the net increase in human welfare over the long term is meaningless. Computer games. Oops, didn't know that was going to happen. I think my assistant must have thought computer games, we have to have a little thing. Broadly speaking, what happens is there are lots and lots of young people trying to create computer games, and in any one year, a small number of them deliver enormous winner-take-all returns. And in 20 years' time, there will still be a lot of people playing computer games, but human welfare won't go up. Computer game design is probably essentially a distributive activity. Maybe also restaurants and bars. I'm not so sure about this. I think in some sense, better run restaurants with better food, that might be fundamental. But quite a lot of might go on here might be simply a competition, rather like a luxury brand job, a competition of people saying, this is the bar which has a particular ambiance which captures people's imagination this year, and the next year, somebody else's imagination. But again, let me point out, suppose you had a nice, socially owned, partnership, collective restaurants business, and suppose the whole of restaurants business didn't really increase social welfare, but we simply churned backwards and forwards between different fashions each year, it still might make sense for that socially owned, partnership restaurant business to pay a hell of a lot of money for a star CEO if they truly did have that ability to think out what was the ambiance design which was going to attract people in the next year. And finally, and most controversially, universities. Now, obviously, all university teachers believe that they are building skills which build human welfare and build a better economy for the future. And that is true to a degree. But actually, part of what is going on in universities is a form of job market signaling whereby achieving a high degree at a university signals to employers that you are a high talent person, and the university is playing a part in providing people with the skills to compete in a somewhat zero-sum distributive game. So I think far more than the problem of marginal private product not being paid, I think we may be in an environment where marginal private product often is just unrelated to marginal social product, and it can be absolutely sensible for remuneration committees to pay huge amounts for activities where the marginal social product and the marginal value to human welfare in some fundamental sense is small. Now, that has always been the case. If you pick up Roger Bootle's idea of creative and distributive activities, you find that it's always been the case that a lot of economic activities are essentially zero-sum competitions. But the hypothesis I want to put is, and it is no more than a hypothesis, but of course if you read this book you might be convinced by this hypothesis, is that as we get richer, an increasing proportion of economic activity, and in particular the economic activity of high talent people, involves distributive competition for existing resources rather than new social value creation. And also that an increasing proportion of social value creation derives from the general progress of science, which produces ideas and understandings which we can then apply as a free good, and from the activities of, bluntly, a very small number of people. I mean, I think that even though I think some forms of GDP per capita growth have no potential to increase human welfare, some things which are delivered by growth probably do. I think it'd be wonderful if we make more medical progress and have even longer lives. But the number of people who will contribute to the pharmaceutical or other developments that give us longer lives is going to be a minute proportion of all the labour in the world, because you just need a very small number of smart people to do that. Let me turn and talk about not jobs and incomes, but wealth. The basic idea in the orthodoxy is that wealth reflects the accumulations of investment, which reflects income. And there's been a very interesting book recently about savings and wealth, and many of you will have heard of it, Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. Probably most of you have heard of that. Many of you will have bought the book. A somewhat smaller proportion have read the book, because it's a very long book. It's rather like Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time. We have it on our shelves to prove that we are intelligent people, but we actually haven't read all the way through. Now, I, however, have read all the way through Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, and it's a good read. And the fundamental point that Piketty points out is that if you look at the relationship between capital wealth and income over the last 50 years, it has gone up dramatically in the rich economies. And in particular, he then points out that this increase from about 2.5 times in 1950 to 5 or even 6 times in some countries in 2010 is quite interesting, because it's reversion, actually, to a pattern in the 18th and 19th century. That in the 18th and 19th century, wealth-to-income ratios, the stock of wealth to the flow of income, tended in the advanced economies, and I've shown it here for France, to be 5 or 6. It falls in mid-20th century to about 2 or 3, and then it increases back to 5 or 6 in most economies since then. And Piketty has some hypothesis of why that has occurred. He points out an equilibrium identity, which mathematically has to be the case, where the wealth-to-income ratio equals the savings rate over the growth rate. I won't go through the proof of that, but if there are any economists here, I expect you to deliver the proof by the end of this lecture. The implication is that if S over G is greater than W over Y, then W over Y will go on increasing until the identity exists. So if savings autonomously increases when the growth rate stays stable, or the growth rate stays stable while the savings rate stays high, then by definition and algebraically you'll get an increase in the wealth-to-income ratio. And that is Piketty's theory, and it's maybe part of it. But I actually think Piketty, in his analysis, has missed the most extraordinary thing that leaps out of his own figures. So let me show you this chart again. And now look at the blue bit. The blue bit is housing. And as you can see, in France from 1950, and this is true in many other countries, in particular in Britain, pretty much all the increase in the wealth-to-income ratio is explained by the increase in the value of housing. And on top of that, some of the rest is explained by the increase in the value of commercial real estate on top of housing. And some of you, well, actually probably not some of the young people, I'm sorry about this, but some of the older people will recognize what has gone on here. I'm lucky enough to own a very nice house in the middle of London, and it's worth about 6 times what I paid for it in 1994. I have to tell you that that increase of 6 times has nothing to do with the fact that I put in some double glazing or a new kitchen. It is almost entirely explained by the increase in the implicit value of the relatively small patch of land on which it sits. And indeed, there's a piece of work by the economist Maurice Schullerich that shows that of that increase in the value of housing, 70 or 80% is explained by the increase of land. And land is locationally specific. It matters where it is. And why are we getting this increase in the value of land? And again, I return to my phrase, the high-tech, high-touch economy. We live in this environment which we call an increasingly software-intensive, IT-intensive, distance-less economy, and yet the biggest increase in wealth is occurring in the most physical thing of all, which is plain, old-fashioned, irreproducible land. Why is that occurring? I think it's fundamentally, in most fundamental terms, a consumer preference effect. As people get, on average, richer, there are some things they will spend an increasing percentage of their money, their income on, and some things a decreasing percentage. In economic terms, there are some things which display an income elasticity greater than 1, others that display an income elasticity less than 1. Food, an income elasticity less than 1. Double someone's income, they don't spend twice as much on food. Clothes, washing machines. Most of us have a limit to how many washing machines we want to buy. As we get richer, we don't buy more washing machines. But actually, one of the things that displays extraordinarily high income elasticity is the desire to buy locationally specific real estate. For a very simple reason that where you live has a huge impact on your standard of living. Whether you live in the middle of London rather than the outer ends of London, or whether, if you're in outer London, are you close to the tube or the railway or a long way away from it, is an enormous determinant of standard of living. And so as we get richer, people devote an increasing proportion of their total income to competing with one another. And again, you can see this is essentially a zero-sum distributional activity. It can't make us all richer simultaneously. It's a competition between each other for an unchanging available pie. We devote an increasing proportion of our income to competing with one another. And the net effect of that is that actually it completely changes the nature of where wealth and capital stock come from. We have a whole series of economic models, if you were to read an economic textbook, which assume that wealth in year T plus the savings rate times income in year T equals wealth in year T plus 1. And that the S times Y, the savings rate times Y, equals the total amount of savings S, equals the amount of investment, which is greater than 0. But actually, the biggest single determinant of the increase of wealth is a relative price effect, which has nothing to do with that. It is that the wealth residing in land in year T times, and I'm using Q for the relative price impact of land in that year, the extent to which land values go up faster than the general price level, produces wealth in year T plus 1. And that can occur even if saving is 0 and investment is 0. Most wealth creation in modern societies and economies is somewhat disconnected from the process of investment, both in relation to land and housing, and, just to remind you, in relation to these extraordinary returns in ICT, where again we saw huge wealth creation essentially deriving from network externality effects. Everybody uses Facebook because everybody uses Facebook, rather than from investment. So our textbooks, our economic textbooks, have a problem. Let me turn to one other area where our economic textbooks have a problem and talk rather briefly, because I need to speed up a bit, about debt. If you were to pick up an economic textbook, I don't necessarily recommend that, but some of you may suffer from insomnia, and read the bit where it explains what banks do, it will tend to say the two following things. Banks take money from depositors and they lend it on to borrowers, and banks lend money to entrepreneurs and businesses, and they thus allocate funds between alternative capital investment projects, and it matters hugely that they do this in an efficient fashion. Unfortunately, and this is actually the key theme of this book, which you should also buy, as a description of what banks do in modern economies, this is an almost entirely mythical statement. Because banks, and crucial point to understand, banks don't take existing money and lend it on. Banks create credit, money, and purchasing power that didn't previously exist. Crucial thing to understand. Matters, therefore, to whom they allocate that purchasing power, and although they can allocate some of it to entrepreneurs and businesses for new capital investment, actually, in the modern economies, most of what they do is lend money against existing real estate. And there's a great piece of work which my institute, the Institute for New Economic Thinking, has funded by three economists, Alan Taylor, Maurice Schulrich, and Oscar Yorda, which has looked at what the banking systems of the advanced economies have done since 1870. Ignore the fluctuations in the early 20th century. When you have hyperinflations and world wars, some pretty crazy things happen to bank balance sheets. But the big story is that from 1870 through to about 1960, about 35% of bank lending was against real estate, and it's now 60%, and it's actually higher than that, because this is just mortgage lending. In addition, there's some categories of commercial real estate lending which are in addition. Why does this matter? It matters because if real estate, existing real estate, is to a degree locationally specific, i.e. there are some places which are more desirable than others, and if it's inherently more difficult to create more of those locationally desirable bits of real estate, such as more Cambridge, one of the areas where we see this phenomenon of locationally desirable real estate, then when you extend more credit, when the banking system extends more credit by creating credit, money, and purchasing power, which is what it can do, the only thing that can give is the price of the real estate and implicitly the price of the land. And in that one, the fundamental problem we have in financial instability in banking systems is driven by this cycle, which Hyman Minsky described, between credit drives asset price increases, drives more credit extended. And so again, what we have in our modern economies is an environment where what the system is doing is quite different from what our economic textbooks suggest. A very large proportion of banking activity is funding a competition between people for the ownership of an asset that already exists, for irreproducible land, and is driving, as a result, instability, and is driving the crisis, the post-crisis malaise in which we now find ourselves. Now, I'm going to skip forward in the interest of time. You can read the book. You have to have a reason to read the book. But what I'm suggesting here is that there are at least two, probably more, drivers of this phenomenon of wealth without savings. One of the things that we have going on in the world is that a lot of private businesses don't have to invest a lot of money. Because if they're investing in software, that's getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. That falling price of capital goods produces a low demand for capital goods, produces lower real interest rates, which gives an even stronger element to the leveraged purchase of existing assets. We have equity value creation without investment. We have wealth accumulation without explicit savings. We have rising real estate prices. We have two different forms of wealth occurring, essentially, which is disconnected from the processes of investment and the efficient allocation of capital which we describe. So I think we've got a bit of a problem. I think growth no longer necessarily gives us higher welfare. I believe technology may be creating an inherently more unequal society. So what do we do? Well, at this stage, when we deal with inequality, there is a standard, what I call nice, rich, liberal, conventional wisdom. Now, I've got nothing against nice, rich liberals. Indeed, some people might say that's probably what I am. I'm relatively well-to-do. I hope I'm nice. I certainly think of myself as liberal. I've got nothing against nice, rich liberals. Wouldn't mind if a nice, rich liberal moved into my street. I mean, I think some of them probably have already. Wouldn't mind my daughters marrying a nice, rich liberal. But there tends to be a consensus among what I call nice, rich liberals, and you can find this in Financial Times or Economist articles on inequality, which go through an absolutely standard pattern, which says inequality is increasing. That's undoubtedly a problem. But the thing you wouldn't want to do is redistribute, because that's old-fashioned. But we have a magic answer to inequality, which is to make sure that everyone has the skills to succeed in the modern economy. And by increasing those skills, we will also increase productivity, which will increase the growth rate. I simply want to point out that if my analysis of the changing nature of our economy is true, then increasing everybody's skills is probably not going to solve the problem of rising inequality. Because in many economic functions, as our economists get richer, what matters is the relative skill ranking, not the absolute skill ranking. If we made everybody a perfectly competent lawyer, I think it would still be the case that the top barristers were paid enormous amounts and lots of other barristers not much. Because what matters is whether you're the best barrister and wins the game which goes on in court. That is obviously true of sports stars. If we made everybody a very good footballer, you know, Rooney's still going to be paid a lot more than the adequate footballer. That's true of the game and app developer. If everybody was able to create games and apps, the economic returns are still going to go to the ones that capture people's imagination in that year. Property developers, investors, it will go to high relative return. Financial traders, brand managers, people who have the ability to create that intangible thing which captures people's imagination. So I don't think that can be the solution. I asked you to imagine a point of view, a scenario to start with, and now let me ask you to imagine this. Imagine that we move to a world in which robots powered by solar power, manufactured by robots, and developed and programmed by a small number of highly skilled people who perform almost all the necessary functions, economic functions in our economy. Imagine that, as it were, your standard of living in terms of, you know, the food that you get and the car that you buy and the electricity that you buy can effectively be produced, you know, tomorrow and for the rest of the year by just 2 or 3% of us programming the robots that program the robots that program the robots, etc. What is the economic consequence of that? Well, John Maynard Keynes thought about that, and in a wonderful article called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, one of his great essays in 1930, he thought about that. And he said, look, we've been through a 200-year process. So actually, he said, we've been through 150 years, and he said there's probably another 50 years to go, which is why he called it Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. He talked about what would it be like in 70 years hence, i.e. not far from where we are at the moment. And he says, in the long run, we're solving our economic problem. Our economic problem was, how did we go from a world of agricultural subsistence where we had to get up every day and work for 15 hours a day just to survive, to an environment where we have this cornucopia of robots producing stuff for us. And he says, in the long run, mankind is solving its economic problem. This means that the economic problem is not, if we look into the future, the permanent problem of the human race. It's not our permanent problem. We will solve that. Thus, for the first time since his creation, man will be faced with his permanent problem. How to use his freedom from pressing economic cares, how to occupy the leisure which service and compound interest, i.e. return on capital, will have won him, to live wisely and agreeably and well. I think we can take it that John Maynard Keynes did include women in this as men. It was just conventional at the time to use a lot of hymns. But if I can, in this college, be allowed to still quote John Maynard Keynes on this, he discusses, will it be a nirvana once we've broken the economic problem, the problem of production? I think we are, in a sense, in the rich developed world, cracking the problem of production, and we can produce everything that we need with less and less people. But I think the society which will emerge from that is a society in which we may naturally, and as a direct result of that, have a very high level of wealth relative to income, with huge value residing in some high-touch things, like irreproducible land in the middle of Manhattan, land in the middle of London, land in Cambridge, brands, Hermes, Louis Vuitton, David Beckham, etc. Apps and network externalities that give huge returns to people who can develop that. I think we may have very high inequality at the top with huge returns to relative skill in these distributive activities, which are increasingly important. Huge celebrity rents, return for people for just being artistically better. Huge returns to beauty. Supermodels are paid massively more as a percentage, as a multiple of ordinary wages than they were 30 or 40 years ago. High inequality at the bottom. Yes, we will continue to create jobs in all the things that we haven't yet automated, but there may be for quite some time a tendency for that to be accompanied with low equilibrium real wages, and for a period somewhat like the early 19th century where real wages lag behind productivity. And I think what we will have in finance, we will have the continual accumulation of debt against existing assets, which creates those cycles, which were the cycle we had in 2008, which are immensely difficult to deal with. That then suggests some policy implications that I think we need to think about. I think we do have a fundamental problem of inequality, rising inequality, and I don't think it's going to be solved by simply saying, let's skill people up. And we're going to have to think about what is the combination of higher minimum wages or in-work benefits or the provision of high-quality public goods paid for with progressive redistributive taxation to deal with it, because I don't think it's going to solve itself in an entirely free market, non-intervention fashion, nor by what, as I say, is the standard nice, rich, liberal answer, which is more skills. I think we were going to have a continual issue about constraining financial instability, and in my second book, which I showed you earlier, I talk about how we do that. I think we also have to accept, and this comes back to the university, that part of what the university ought to be doing is to educate people not just for success in a competitive rat race, but to live well and agreeably and as good citizens within society, rather than as simply units of factor input to production. I think there are some big implications for developing countries, and they really worry me. If over the next 10 to 20 years, somebody creates the robot that replicates the dexterity of fingers in textile and footwear manufacture, then we are removing one of the classic ladders of early economic growth, which has been used by Bangladesh, by China, by other countries around the world, and which countries like Ethiopia want to do, because we will end up producing all the textiles and footwear we want back here in developed countries, but with almost no employment. We don't really know a path of successful development which does not involve a phase of mass manufacturing as one of the intermediate phases. That's what Korea did, that's what China's done, that's what Hong Kong did, that's what Bangladesh has to a degree managed to do, that's what Vietnam is trying to do, etc. We just don't know another model, and robotization and automation may kick away that ladder in a way which we really need to think about. But my main focus in what I've said has been, as it were, the problems of the rich, rather than the problems of the poor, though I think they are indeed more important. And what I'm saying is we may be moving into an environment where we have, as it were, solved the problems of production in this economy, which I sum up as being a high-tech, high-touch economy. And that, as it were, a lot of that neoclassical theory that I set up at front and that justification for capitalism no longer resides. The orthodoxy is that we need capitalism because it's superior, because it delivers faster growth, which delivers faster increase in human welfare. Inequality is justified because it spurs effort, entrepreneurship, and growth. But that's what I call the instrumental argument for capitalism is somewhat collapsing. I think it's still there to a degree, but I think it's less powerful than it was. I think, however, there is actually another justification for free markets, and I think it's actually a more fundamental one. And if you go back to the early political economists, the Ricardos, the Adam Smiths, the David Humes, it was actually the argument that they put forward with the idea that free markets would produce faster growth as only an ancillary argument. And actually, the case for the free market as a thing which is valuable in itself, rather than because instrumentally it delivers higher growth, has actually been put by Amartya Sen. The point he makes in Development as Freedom is that the freedom of people to act as they like in deciding where to work, what to produce, what to consume, the freedom of somebody to set up as an entrepreneur and say, I want to produce a new product and see whether I flourish in the world, that is valuable in and of itself. And the merit of the market does not lie only in its capacity to generate more efficient culmination outcomes, but in the processes by which those outcomes are achieved. I think that is the more fundamental argument for the free market, in a sense, for capitalism. But if that is the argument, and if we can no longer support an instrumental argument that ever more free markets deliver ever faster growth, which is axiomatically good for human welfare, then we have to accept that we accept that justification, but we will also need to wrap capitalism around with many social interventions to make sure that it is delivering improvements in human welfare in a way which I think is probably less certain than it was in the great period of Robert Gordon's 1870 to 1970. Those are my hypotheses. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.